it's Ellie Masters, and I hope you're enjoying this free audio exclusive of Rescuing Melissa, a spine-tingling thriller and steamy romance, all rolled into one.
JEM Publishing presents the unabridged recording of Rescuing Melissa, The Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1, written by Ellie Masters, narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.
46. Petals. CJ. You seen him too? CJ's interest perked up. Jenny hadn't been with him and Mac at the hospital. Where?
Damn, I don't know.
She played with her long braids and pursed her lips.
Recently, though.
Shit. Another coincidence? I need to know where you saw him.
I'm thinking.
Jenny lifted her hands in the air.
Stop pestering or it'll never come to me.
Gripping Melissa's phone, he couldn't help hitting the replay button. The video's poor resolution and low lighting made it difficult to ascertain details. There was the flapping of something white and a man with black shoes. He pressed the pause button, backing up the recording, and started it forward again. Immediately after the flapping fabric, a blur of red fluttered. He waved Jenny over. Look at this. He cued the video and slowed down the rate to watch frame by frame. A blur of red materialized on the screen. His heart thumped. Seeing Melissa's kidnapping play out in front of him had him in anguish. This was all his fault. Jenny pointed at the flash of red.
Back it up.
He shoved the phone in her hand and got to his knees, looking at the carpet, under the couch, and even under the bed. He crawled all over the room.
What are you looking for?
I think it was a rose petal. But there were no signs of roses in the room, not even the lingering perfume of them. Mac wandered into the hotel room. What are you doing?
CJ found something in the video.
It's not much, CJ said with a pained sigh. The couch groaned under the weight of Mac's massive frame. Mac and Jenny pressed their heads together as she showed him the part of the video under question.
CJ thinks it's a rose.
Jenny said.
It was. Hundreds of red roses.
A lilting voice proclaimed. Framed by the doorway, a walking cliché struck a pose. From her platinum locks to her double Ds, the striking beauty screamed college cheerleader, every man's wet dream brought to life. Still, it was the holster strapped to her hip, with the sweet .45 revolver tucked into it, which snatched his attention and garnered CJ's respect. Good to see you, Charlie. What did you find out? Her smile sported signature dimples and perfectly straight white teeth. She rocked back and buried her hands in the back pockets of her hip-hugging jeans. Charlie was walking male kryptonite, and a wise ass, too. They had confirmation now, and he had too many coincidences lining up. His gut churned, and his mind picked at the pieces of how Melissa and Henrietta Jones might be connected.
Security didn't want to share, but I sweet-talked them into giving me access to their tapes. Want to see?
Charlie winked.
The guy who took your girl was delivering roses.
He had a good idea who that might have been. Fuck. Where was Scott Patterson in all this mess? Not for a minute did he believe Scott didn't have his fingers embroiled in Melissa's disappearance. They needed to find a connection. I need to know who Scott Patterson communicated with while in prison. If the man with the roses and Patterson knew each other, they were running out of time.
On it.
Jenny tapped her phone. 2 men filled the doorway behind Charlie. The tall, muscular man standing to Charlie's left had a scar on his cheek. Brett Parmley frowned. We got confirmation on the roses from the cleaning staff. John Nutt was similar in build to CJ. Tall and broad, sported deep-set penetrating eyes. John stepped around Charlie and stretched out his hand. Sorry your leaf got fucked up. Same here, he replied. Hope we can help. Brett extended his hand, completing the meet and greet. Nice to have the team together again. He couldn't ask for a better team. Tell me what you found, CJ demanded. John leaned against the doorframe, kicking one heel over the other foot. Cleaning lady said a man came by with an impressive display of roses, stopped here, chatted with the guest in this room, wheeled the cart inside, and then wheeled it out a few minutes later. Took the freight elevator down to the loading dock. The fucker cleaned up after himself. CJ scrubbed his jaw. There wasn't a trace of rose in the room. At least they hadn't been tulips. Scott Patterson had an obsession with tulips. Charlie nodded.
Video footage confirms. A guy with a cart and a boatload of red roses came to this floor and left not 15 minutes later. He was in and out.
Fucker hid Melissa in the cart and shoved the roses in there with her. His fists clenched. You have a picture of his face? He didn't need a picture. He knew who took Melissa, but he needed confirmation. Adrenaline surged through his veins and raced around until it gathered in his heart and slammed against his chest. With a photo of his face and the plates off his van, they wouldn't have to wait for a database match to figure out where he lived. The girls had provided that bit of information. CJ felt 1,000 times better knowing the kidnapper had made such a juvenile mistake. Charlie looked down.
Only a partial on his face. He knew where all the cameras were located and shielded his face from the lens. There's footage in the loading dock with a cart, but same problem. No clear shot of his face.
That was okay. With the sketches, CJ didn't need a clear shot. It wasn't enough for a warrant, but he and his team didn't necessarily bother with warrants. What about plates?
Obscured,
She said.
he probably muddied them up for the job.
One of the cleaning ladies got a good look at him, Brett said. CJ grabbed Anna's and Angela's sketches off the couch. Have her look at these. I need a positive ID. Charlie glanced at the sketches.
Odd. Looks like a Jekyll and Hyde rendition of the same man.
Mac peered over Charlie's shoulder. That guy was in the bar. Jenny snatched the sketches.
Holy fuck, I knew he looked familiar. He helped that old lady, the one that tripped. This might be the guy from the security tapes,
Charlie added.
but I need to see the footage again.
CJ's blood chilled. I know him. Had the fucker lifted his phone? Because he sure as shit didn't see it around the hotel room. He wasn't one to leave things lying around and assumed he'd been careless when his phone had gone missing. Is that how the man had gained access to the room? The hospital, Max said. He thumped CJ in the arm. We saw him at the hospital too. Mac had a gray memory. Melissa knew him. He delivered flowers to her at the hospital. She may even have trusted him enough to open the door. Even more so if the guy had lifted CJ's phone and had been using it to reassure her. Fuck. We need to trace my phone's location. It was possible the man still had it. Jekyll and Hyde was a good description of the two images provided by Angela and Anna.
He looked at my...
Poor Angela was too young, too embarrassed to say what she wanted to say, but old enough for the blossom of youth to change her body and wise enough to know a man looking at her chest was wrong. Melissa had taken the flower arrangement. He'd shoved a hand wrapped in bloody bandages toward her. It's Pierce Channing. CJ ground his teeth, and his stomach nodded at the memory. The fucker's name is Pierce Channing. He turned to Charlie. Please tell me the van at the docks was a white florist's van, black windows, with a big scratch down the left side? Charlie's jaw gaped.
How did you know?
Jenny thumbed her phone to life.
I'll find an address.
Don't bother. He headed for the door, pitching his words over his shoulder as he raced out the hall. I know where the bastard lives. He cut his gaze to Mac. Fuck it all to hell. Not only have we found Melissa, we may have just found the man who took Henrietta Jones.
47. Locks. Melissa. Pierce and Scott talked about dungeons and abductions like it was the weather. Pierce held Melissa cuffed and chained, with the hammer of her heart rattling her teeth while he droned on about the dungeon downstairs. Scott cocked his head.
I'm interested to see how you improved my design.
His gaze roamed over her body, lingering on her breasts, and sent a chill up her spine. The tortured screams of his victims reflected in the depths of those eyes, and echoed their never-ending torment in her mind. And was that the smell of dead animals creeping up from the basement? She tugged on her chains, caged more by Pierce's unwavering grip than by her bonds. Scott pumped Pierce for information about the dungeon. Didn't Pierce realize why that might be? His body would be left down there with hers and others if she understood about these princesses. Dear God, this was worse than her most terrifying nightmare. Her vision zoomed in on Scott's twitchy hands. All she could see were fingernails caked in more blood than she ever wanted to think about. The bead of sweat forming at his hairline betrayed his unease, and his eyes shifted to the knife block behind Pierce. Melissa took a quick inventory, and the knot in her stomach eased, seeing all the spots still sported knives. Scott would need an alternate weapon, but he would find one. Pierce shifted back, and the creak of the floorboard beneath his foot had her jerking against her restraints. The wind howled outside and rattled the window panes. Her heart pounded and her breathing deepened when Pierce gestured for Scott to head to the basement. Pierce followed, carrying her in his arms. Her opportunity to escape had come and gone, and she'd done nothing. Nothing but sit like a sack of potatoes in Pierce's arms. Why hadn't she tried to scream? Scott would be allowed 10 strikes, and although she'd vowed not to give him the satisfaction of her screams, he would drag agony from her body until he satiated his sadistic needs. Putting up a brave front would only intensify the beating to come. Pierce stepped between rows of shelving filled with crates of supplies that extended into the gloom of the dark basement. A single incandescent bulb lit their way. Scott turned in a slow circle, admiring the ordered boxes.
Where's the entrance to the dungeon?
Melissa twisted her wrists. Locks bound the cuffs, and more locks attached the chains connecting her hands to her feet. She'd been trussed up and immobilized.
This way.
Pierce headed to the back wall. There were enough supplies to last for years. Pallets of bottled water formed a wall to the left. Stacked beside them were filters of various types. More shelves stood to the right. There was barely enough room for Pierce to carry her between the shelving units. Her toes brushed stacks of water, crates of canned goods, and vacuum-packed food. The basement ended at an impressive wine rack. Hundreds of bottles lay on their sides. Pierce jostled for position in the narrow confines and snagged his toe under the wooden wine rack. He activated a lever of some sort. The wall of wine slid to the side and revealed a heavy wooden door hidden behind. A combination lock barred further progress. He jostled her, freeing one hand to spin the combination. The lock released with a snick, and he pushed open the door. Carrying her further underground, the concrete floor of the basement gave way to hard, packed dirt. Behind them, the wine wall slid back in place with a churning of gears. Cops might come, but they'd never find this entrance. Fear pulled a whimper from her throat, and she curled inward, pressing her eyes closed. But she wouldn't face her fate afraid or blind. Melissa blinked and forced herself to take in her surroundings. Poured concrete of the basement no longer held back the dirt or stabilized the ceiling. Instead, a mixture of soil and rock, shored up with timber, formed the passage, making her think of a mining tunnel. A string of incandescent light bulbs marched off down a tunnel longer than she imagined capable of lying beneath a home. A yellow glow lit their way. Pierce's breathing changed, becoming deeper with each pull of his breath until the tunnel ended abruptly around a sharp bend. A rough wooden door covered in locks waited.
Take her,
he said, spinning to Scott and thrusting her into her ex-husband's arms.
I have to open the next lock, and I can't do it while holding her.
His lips twisted, as if he didn't appreciate having to relinquish control to Scott. She cried out when Scott's fingers dug into the bruising down her side. He held her with much less assurance than Pierce had, and within moments, Scott's hold slipped. He hefted her weight and readjusted his grip. Prison must have weakened him more than she thought. The feel of Scott's arms wrapping around her had her heart leaping to her throat. He smelled different from what she remembered, stale, like a cold prison cell. He placed more pressure on her bruised ribs, causing her to wince in pain. Pierce worked at the lock to an ominous door.
Did you miss me?
His sour stench infiltrated her nostrils. She clenched her teeth. I mourn the loss of the man I fell in love with. He tilted her and pressed his lips against her forehead.
Nonsense. I love you with every fiber of my being, just as you still love me. Why do you think I did those things to those girls instead of you?
You don't have to do this. Rationalizing made no sense, but she had to try. Laughter bubbled in his chest, chilling her blood and slowing the beat of her heart. His fetid breath had her cringing.
Don't worry, love. I don't want to kill you. You belong to him now, my gift to my protege. He treasures his princesses. That's what he calls his little whores, and you'll become his majestic queen. But you need to pay for what you did, and Pierce will make sure you suffer a very long time. Much more fitting than death for what you did.
His words chilled her soul.
He's right about me hanging around. I can't stay. They're probably subpoenaing my mail as we speak. Pierce has been smart, but they'll follow his trail. The police will come to see if I've stopped by. He knows this, but Pierce has prepared. They'll never find this underground retreat. But one night among friends is a twist of fate I can't ignore. I'm honored to spend this day with him. And you.
Pierce returned from unlocking the door. He gestured for Scott to give her back. Scott tightened his grip. The muscles of his jaw clenched.
We spoke about you in our letters,
Scott said.
I thought it fitting you belonged to a man like him. He knows how to punish you for your betrayal.
I never betrayed you,
You took vows.
Scott said with a growl.
To love, honor, and obey. You did not honor me or obey me when you handed over the keys to the shed. You shouldn't have done that.
I had no choice.
You should have protected me.
They had a search warrant, she argued.
You done chatting?
Pierce yanked her out of Scott's hold. Melissa's stomach flipped as Scott released her back to Pierce, who cradled her in arms much stronger than Scott's. Pierce handed Scott 6 locks.
Pull the door shut behind you. I locked the door from the inside.
He ducked inside the next room. Melissa gasped at the size of the place. A king bed dominated the room. 2 rows of what looked to be cages ran down the sides, and what was chained against the far wall? Her chest tightened and she struggled to breathe. Not what, but who was chained against the far wall? Scott grunted with the effort of pulling the thick door back into position. He slid the bolt into place and locked them inside.
Check it,
Pierce demanded. He spun to face the door, taking away her vision of the horrible room.
They're locked.
Scott said.
All of them. Recheck them.
Scott pulled and tugged on the locks.
Satisfied? Again.
Pierce insisted.
Seriously?
Her husband frowned.
Again.
Pierce's voice was low and flat, lacking all the overtones she had noticed before. It made him appear even more lethal than Scott. Melissa peeked over Pierce's shoulder. She didn't pray for strength. She hoped for a quick death.
48. Tunnel. Pierce. The man before me paled compared to the legacy I had modeled my life after. Scott Patterson came desperate and needy, so much less than the man who had accomplished greatness in the past. The voice in the letters, the years of correspondence we had exchanged. I thought he stood at a fount of wisdom dispensing knowledge through the years. How horribly wrong I had been. And I didn't want to share my queen. Lines of power needed to be established. Fear poured off my queen when she looked at him. That adoration belonged to me, not to the shell of a man who'd once been my mentor. I can't believe you dug this out yourself, Scott said with awe. He wouldn't have the patience for something this scale, nor the strength to build it with his bare hands. It took time. My comment fell on a mind lacking vision. "Where did you keep them while you were tunneling this out?" "I only had Belle. She stayed in the basement." "Ah, your Belle. I'm intrigued to meet her." My shoulders stiffened, thinking of his filthy hands touching my Belle. "Belle won't be playing tonight," I announced with more bite than intended. Belle was forever and always mine. Now, how to get rid of him? I couldn't turn him in. That was a one-way street for us both. He would head back to execution by lethal injection. I might be judged, but my actions wouldn't buy death. A lingering life in prison would be my fate, a decision made by those who didn't understand. I would die before going to jail. He knew this, as did I. We were locked in a stalemate. I couldn't deny his request. He didn't dare cross me. We were like the armed society of the Old West, polite to the extreme because the damage we could cause with our weapons would be lethal to us both. Allowing him this night of punishment, even if it meant letting him defile one of my princesses, would be worthwhile if it ensured his departure in the morning. Two men such as us did not belong together. We were two very different beasts. I had waited for years to bring my queen to her kingdom. I itched to stroke her skin, to feel every inch of her flawless body. Having to wait, being forced to let him have her first, filled me with rage. Jealousy burned my gut, and I swallowed against the rising bile every time he opened his mouth. There were only two outcomes. We separated at dawn, or one of us died tonight. I couldn't deny Scott's skill, vision, or unique perspective, but how dare he stick his nose in the middle of my business? Prison had made him weak. He could barely hold the weight of his wife. I think his mind had weakened too. "I'm impressed by your thoroughness," he said. "No one will ever find the tunnel the way you have it hidden behind the wine." He tipped his head, but his praise meant nothing. Our eyes locked, and I measured the man I'd idolized for so many years. The study of his techniques had provided me long hours of practice. I had explored and accepted my dark urges under his tutelage. At the same time, he guided my hands, honed my skill, and kept me safe when I'd been inexperienced. His advice saved me from prison many times. Stupid mistakes I would have made had it not been for his caution. I owed him a small measure of gratitude for that. But a truth hung between us, unspoken and dangerous. The student had surpassed the master. Perhaps this was fated to be, the two of us sharing this night. A graduation of sorts. "Welcome to my dungeon." The left side of my mouth crooked up. Scott stepped forward in a rush. I whispered into my queen's ear, trying to soothe her as I prepared her to endure. "I can protect you, but only if you obey. You won't suffer long at your husband's hand." She refused to meet my eyes, but I didn't need her consent. All I required was she understood her place. "This is your home now. You decide your fate, my queen. Every choice is yours to make. Every consequence is a result of the decisions you make." "Holy fuck, you have a man chained to the wall." I flinched at the recrimination in his tone, then straightened my spine. An extreme homophobe, I needed to make sure he didn't get the wrong idea. I lay my queen on the four-poster bed's black silk sheets and unlocked the chain connecting her wrists and feet. Poor thing must be in agony. But now she could stretch out and relieve the kinks in her body. Her comfort was important to me. I kept the chain attached to the collar around her throat, and her wrist cuffs locked together, but I freed her feet. Our fairy godmother had been placed in her cage nearest the bed. Her eyes showed white all around as she clutched the bars. Delicious to see such fear. "You have a thing for guys?" Disgust ran thick in Scott's voice. I clenched my jaw and forced a smile. Gretel lay in her cage, covered in bandages. I got carried away with some knife play. He's a nurse and stitched poor Gretel up." Scott looked at me as if I were an idiot. I didn't like his expression one bit. He continued in a caustic tone, "You can always get another princess." He jerked a thumb toward my bound, hooded, and gagged male nurse. "He has to die." Scott made the pronouncement into the silence of my dungeon like it was his place to decide. It was not his place at all. I hated him. This was my kingdom, not his. The nurse thrashed in his chains, pulling and tugging until I thought he would dislocate his shoulders. Blood dripped down his wrists from his previous attempts to free himself. "That isn't our agreement." I shrugged. The nurse was a dead man walking, but I still needed him. "Once Gretel is better, I'm letting him go." Scott rubbed his hands together. "That's a mistake. Let me take care of him." More thrashing followed, bringing a smile to my lips. Now this could be interesting, and a perfect way to keep my hands clean. Scott Patterson was such an idiot.
49. Dungeon. Melissa. The world tilted as Pierce dropped Melissa onto the massive bed. She bounced on the spongy mattress and flopped to her side. A wave of nausea surged up and demanded an outlet, but she swallowed down the acid burn. Her shoulders ached from her bindings, and her hips cramped against the forced flexion caused by the tight chains. Her knees fared no better. The linings of the ankle and wrist cuffs protected her skin. Her wrists and ankles weren't abraded and raw, but that was a small blessing considering she was now in Pierce's dungeon. Much bigger than she imagined. The dungeon looked to be a converted storm shelter. How had he dug this out of the earth? How had he hidden it from the neighbors? The bed took up the front part of the room. The back of the shelter had been removed, and the space extended, dug out of the earth. Thick timbers shored up the roof. Poured concrete filled in the gaps between naturally occurring boulders to form the walls. The whole place was horrifically cozy. On the far wall, a man was in chains, his arms pulled brutally over his head. An iron bar at his ankles forced his legs far apart. A black hood covered his face with holes for eyes, nose, and mouth, and a gag had been stuffed in his mouth. Terrified eyes stared out of the hood as the man thrashed against his bonds. As if that wasn't scary enough, 8 cages lined the space between her and the man on the wall. Every cell held a woman, except the one to the left of the bed, which remained empty. Her stomach twisted, wondering if that one was meant for her. The women made no sounds except for the slight rustle of movement. Soiled princess gowns adorned them. Scott paced the length of the cages, his gaze cutting left and right with a predatory intensity and a pang of desperate hunger. What sort of mind created such a place? Scott's voice dropped an octave, turned husky and sickening.
This must be Gretel.
Gretel.
Pierce commanded.
Present yourself to our guest.
The woman knelt, hands on her thighs, head bowed. The poor thing could barely hold herself steady.
I thought you kept them naked. Why are they dressed?
Pierce pointed at the man chained against the wall.
Because of him. Does it even matter?
Scott already dismissed the man on the wall. Beneath the black hood, the whites of the man's eyes grew even wider. Her heart went out to him. She didn't know how to help him, but prayed for a miracle.
I suppose it doesn't.
Pierce clapped his hands, making Melissa jump.
Princesses, line up for your guest. Kneel before a great man.
Rustling sounded all around. The women positioned themselves at the front of the cages. Without a break in his step, Scott called out their names.
Gretel, Cinderella, Red Riding Hood, Sleeping Beauty, Goldilocks, and this must be your Belle.
He stopped at the cage closest to the bed and pointed to the last woman.
I don't recognize this one. You've added to the collection?
Pierce stepped away from the bed, and Melissa craned her neck to get a better view of the room. Opposite from the cages, beside the chained man, a sight out of a medieval torture chamber revealed itself. Wood benches, padded with leather, sat beneath rows of whips, chains, and devices she'd only ever read about. They looked well used.
"This is our fairy godmother,"
Pierce said with pride.
"She's in training, 1 week in, and she's learning how to please me. Aren't you, Henrietta?"
Yes, my prince. The woman issued a weak whisper. It couldn't be.
"Too old for my taste,"
Scott said with a sour tone.
"You'd be surprised.
Pierce crowed.
Her oral skills are pleasing. I'm not interested in someone so old. She's not much older than your wife."
Scott turned, and she shrunk away from the brutality in her ex-husband's eyes.
"I don't want to fuck my wife either."
He pointed to the 2 blondes in the middle.
"Can I have them? Beauty and Goldie?" "You don't need 2.
Pierce said.
I'll start with 1 and see where the night leads us."
Scott rubbed his hands together. He turned, and his attention focused on the wall of torture.
"What can I use?" "I thought you wanted to deal with your wife's punishment first."
Scott glanced back, and Melissa dropped her gaze.
"Haven't had a woman in 3 years. I'm hard as a rock and ready to fuck. I'll deal with her later. Beauty is good with her mouth."
Pierce suggested.
"I don't allow them out of the cages more than 1 at a time."
He snapped his fingers, and the woman moved.
"On your knees, Beauty."
He turned to Scott.
"She stays in the cage. You don't need her out for this. A blowjob."
Scott sounded disappointed, but he unfastened his pants. His eyes flicked toward Melissa, and she dropped her gaze, not wanting to incite her husband any more than necessary.
"What about teeth and biting?" "Beauty won't bite, and she knows better than to scrape with her teeth. Don't you, Beauty?"
Yes, my prince, came a soft reply. Pierce placed a hand on Melissa's head, gripping her hair. He lifted her to face him.
"Don't worry, my queen. You'll have plenty of opportunity to perfect your skills, too."
He tapped her lips with his free hand and then released her hair. Melissa's head swam with horrifying images of her future if she didn't find a way to get free. Scott dropped his pants and pressed against the bars, wiggling his hips as he did. His guttural sigh told her everything she didn't want to know.
"Holy fuck, that's amazing,"
Scott said with a groan. Pierce shifted his attention to Melissa, giving the strangest look. It was at once compassionate and cruel. His fingers snapped, and he stepped to the cage holding the woman he'd called Belle. He unfastened his pants and freed himself. He rested his head against the bars and sighed as Belle pressed her lips to his cock.
"Serve your prince, my beautiful Belle."
The men's low sounds of pleasure filled the room. Melissa fought her bindings, coming no closer to unfastening the locks. She propped herself on her elbows, determined to get a better view of her surroundings. The manacled man stared back, blinking behind his hood. She turned away, knowing his fate, and helpless to do anything about it. Her gaze landed on the cage closest to the bed. The woman inside mouthed, "Are you okay?"
50. Suburbia. CJ. CJ let Mac drive, or maybe Mac insisted. He didn't argue, because the decision seemed a wise choice, considering how his heart banged around inside his chest and how his palms were slicked with sweat. This wasn't his usual calm self. Jenny called shotgun, but 1 look from him, and she took the back seat. The rest of Delta Team, John Nutt, Brett Parmley, and the bubbly Charlene Malden, followed in a separate car. "You gonna explain how you know where this guy lives?" Mac's throaty growl bounced around the inside of the car. He blew through a stop sign. "I was with the girls," he recounted, the girls' cookie expedition. "I stopped while the girls talked, and a van pulled into the driveway." He punched the dash. "I saw him. The fucking van. I saw it, and the timing." The timing fit with Melissa's abduction. The late afternoon sun was fading. Clouds had blown in, a storm brewing perhaps, and the wind was picking up.
How could you have known?
Jenny's warm hand touched his shoulder, rubbing at the tension in his muscles. Anna's sister knew. He rubbed the top of his head.
What do you mean?
She asked. Angela got a weird vibe from him. Anna never picked up on it. Sounds like a perv, Max said. CJ had looked in the side mirror. Brett Parmley blew through a red light, trying to keep up with Max driving.
Do we have a plan?
Jenny asked.
Are we just going to knock on the door and say, hey, give me my girl back?
CJ ground his teeth. Something like that. Max's tone turned serious. Did anyone phone Sam? He's going to flip when he finds out we've gone all Rambo and didn't tell him. CJ kept silent. He'd raced out of the hotel suite without a word. His team had followed after him, catching up at the elevators. The explanation about Pierce Channing left grim expressions on everyone's faces by the time they'd reached the lobby. He'd kept moving, not wanting to wait on the feds. They were busy following leads on Scott Patterson's disappearance, and convincing them that this was their best lead would take time he refused to waste.
I'll call,
Jenny said. CJ fixed his eyes forward, thinking they couldn't get there fast enough. They had no plan. Other than storming the place, all they could do was ring the doorbell. He needed eyes inside before charging in and making a fatal mistake. He chewed at his cheek, trying to strategize, failing miserably because all he could think about was the video on Melissa's cell phone. Jenny spoke with Sam, her voice even and smooth.
Hey, we have a lead on the kidnapper. CJ is confident it's the same person who took Henrietta Jones.
She paused as Sam responded. Only the growl of his voice could be heard.
The name is Pierce Channing.
She continued.
Hey, did you get a copy of the sketch artist's drawings?
More silence while she listened.
The girl sold cookies at his house, and the younger girl remembers him sitting next to her mother at the park the following day. There's more.
Jenny told Sam about the sketches and the surveillance tapes. She paused, listening to Sam's questions, and then answered.
So far, it appears the guy's working alone. No connection to Scott Patterson.
Silence again, this time longer. Jenny tapped him on the shoulder.
Hey, CJ?
What? She handed him the phone.
Sam wants to talk to you.
He grimaced as he took the phone. Yeah, boss? What the fuck is going on? The sharp tone of Sam's voice spoke volumes. Jenny told you what's going on. He directed Mac as they headed out of town. You're headed to this guy's house? We are. A long pause followed. I want you to listen. Sam spoke slow and easy, a calming influence not generally present when his boss tried to get the point across. You listening? Yes. Under no circumstances are you to enter. I'm almost there, and I'm coming with backup. I've got my whole team. We're good. Brett and John were terrific. He trusted his life to them. Charlie never ceased to prove her skills. You're not listening. Because you're not making sense. We've got this. No, you don't. Sam's sigh wasn't lost through the phone connection. CJ could only imagine the shake of Sam's head as he prepared to break the bad news. Pierce Channing's name has come to my attention. Well, of course, CJ said with irritation. We just reported it. Shut the fuck up and listen. CJ snapped his mouth shut, grinding his teeth together. You listening? When he said nothing, Sam asked again, CJ? You told me to shut the fuck up, he said through gritted teeth. Pierce Channing is the name of Scott Patterson's most prolific pen pal. Does that paint the picture for you? Shit. Do not go inside that house, Sam ordered. If this guy's working for Patterson, there's a good chance he knows where Patterson is hiding or has Patterson there. I'll be there in an hour and a half. I have 2 teams with me and SWAT on the way. An hour and a half. No fucking way would he wait that long. She could be dead by then. If you blow in there with a half-cocked plan, she will be, trust me. Trust wasn't the issue. Time was their enemy. Mac pulled into the housing development. CJ had him stop several houses down from Patterson's home. "I'll take that under advisement," he said to Sam with a growl. "You'd better." He ended the call and debriefed Mac and Jenny. "So," Mac said, "we're going to sit and wait?" "I have no intention of sitting around," CJ said. "Besides, I have a plan."
Hello, this is Ellie Masters, and I hope that you're enjoying Rescuing Melissa. We are really getting down to the wire here. Scott and Pierce together are just bad news combined. And Melissa, she's been captured and she is present in there. CJ better hurry up or he's not going to rescue her. But hey, CJ's a guardian, and guardians always rescue those who can't help themselves. Until next time, this is Ellie Masters.
We hope you have enjoyed this unabridged production of Rescuing Melissa, the Guardian Hostage Rescue Specialists, Book 1. Written by Ellie Masters. Narrated by Aubrey Vincent and Matt Haynes.